I overheard my daughter-in-law say they would send me to a nursing home before the burgers had even finished grilling, and that was the moment I realized I had already stayed too long in a place that was no longer mine. I remember standing there by the old charcoal grill in Daniel's backyard, the late afternoon sun settling low over the fence, the smell of smoke and barbecue sauce hanging thick in the air, the kind of smell that used to mean family, comfort, something steady and familiar. But that day it felt different, like something sour had slipped into it without anyone noticing. I had arrived early, just like I always did, carrying a bowl of homemade potato salad that I'd been making the same way for over 30 years, the same way Daniel used to ask for when he was a boy, back when he would tug at my sleeve and say, "Mom, make the one with extra mustard," and I would laugh and pretend I hadn't already planned to. Ashley had greeted me with a quick smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder as if we were close, as if there wasn't something unspoken stretching between us, and she'd said, "You didn't have to bring anything, Margaret." Even though she knew I always did, even though she knew it mattered to me. I had nodded, smiled back, set the bowl on the long folding table already crowded with store-bought dishes, plastic containers still half open, everything looking neat but impersonal, like a display rather than a meal meant to be shared. Daniel had been by the cooler, laughing with one of his co-workers, a beer already in his hand, and when he saw me, he gave me a quick wave, not coming over, not hugging me the way he used to, just a wave, as if I were another guest and not the woman who had raised him, and I told myself it was nothing, that people get busy, that life changes, that sons grow up and become men with their own families, their own routines. I spent the next hour doing what I always did, moving quietly through the space, straightening things that didn't need straightening, offering to help where no help was really needed, listening more than speaking, smiling when someone made a joke, even when I wasn't quite sure I'd heard it properly, and every now and then I would glance at Daniel, waiting for that moment when he might come stand beside me, ask how I was doing, tell me something small and ordinary, but that moment never quite came. It was just before sunset when I stepped away from the table, carrying an empty tray back toward the side of the house, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes, the noise of laughter fading slightly as I rounded the corner, and that's when I heard her. Ashley's voice, low but clear, the kind of voice you use when you think you're safe, when you think no one important is listening. She was standing near the back fence with her friend, a glass of wine in her hand, her posture relaxed, almost amused, and she said, "Honestly, it's just a matter of time. We'll send her to a nursing home. It'll be easier for everyone." There was a small pause, the kind that lets words settle, and then a soft laugh, not cruel in volume, but sharp enough to cut straight through me, and her friend murmured something I couldn't quite catch, something that made Ashley shrug and add, "I mean, she can't manage a place like this forever," and Daniel agrees. He just doesn't want to deal with the conversation yet. I stood there, just out of sight, my hand still gripping the edge of the tray, my fingers tightening slowly without me realizing it. And for a moment, everything seemed to go very quiet, not because the noise had stopped, but because it no longer reached me the same way. I didn't step forward. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe any differently. I simply listened, the way I had learned to listen over the years, carefully, completely, letting each word settle into place. Daniel agrees. That was the part that stayed with me, heavier than the rest, heavier than the mention of a nursing home, heavier than the casual certainty in her voice, because it meant this wasn't just a passing thought, not just a careless comment. It was a plan, something discussed, something decided, something I had not been part of. I stayed there for a few seconds longer, long enough to hear them change the subject, long enough to understand that whatever had just been said was, to them, already settled, already normal, already justified. Then I turned, just as quietly as I had arrived, and walked back toward the yard, the tray still in my hands, my steps steady, my face unchanged. When I came back into view, no one noticed anything different. Daniel was still laughing. Ashley was still smiling. The grill was still smoking. And I smiled too, because in that moment, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. They thought they were planning my future. They thought they had time. What they didn't know was that I had already begun making my own plans, and unlike theirs, mine did not include waiting to be asked to leave. The next morning arrived quietly, the way most mornings do when nothing on the surface has changed, even though everything underneath has shifted. I woke before the alarm, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day, sorting through pieces that had once felt disconnected and now fit together with an uncomfortable precision. The house was still, the early light filtering through the curtains in soft, pale lines, and for a moment I lay there listening to the silence, realizing how familiar it had become without me ever truly acknowledging it. I got up slowly, moving through my usual routine, starting the coffee maker, opening the blinds, letting in the cool morning air, each action steady and deliberate, as if I were anchoring myself in something reliable while everything else continued to rearrange itself in my thoughts. I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard, the same yard where Daniel had once played for hours, where I had watched him learn to ride a bicycle, where scraped knees and small victories had once filled the space with noise and meaning. Now it was just grass and stillness, neat and untouched, like a photograph that had lost its motion. I took a slow sip and let my mind return to the previous evening, not with the shock I might have expected, but with a calm, almost detached clarity, replaying Ashley's words, the tone of her voice, the certainty behind it, and more importantly, the absence of hesitation. That was what stayed with me the most. There had been no doubt in her voice, no question about whether it would happen, only when. I set the cup down and walked back to the small drawer by the sink, this time pulling it open fully, sliding aside the neatly stacked envelopes until I reached the documents I had not looked at in years. The deed to the house, the insurance papers, a copy of my will, carefully folded and placed beneath everything else. I lifted the papers slowly, not with urgency, but with intention, placing them on the kitchen table and smoothing them out with my hand, reading through them line by line, not because I did not already know what they said, but because I needed to see them again with the understanding I had now. For years, I had believed that everything was simple, that what was mine would naturally remain mine, that the life I had built would not need to be defended, only maintained. But as I read, I began to notice details I had once overlooked, the way certain arrangements could be interpreted, the way assumptions could quietly become vulnerabilities if left unexamined. I thought about the last time Daniel had shown any interest in these things, and I realized it had been a long time, long enough for distance to settle into something more permanent. He had trusted me to handle everything, or perhaps he had simply stopped thinking about it altogether, leaving space for someone else to think about it instead. Ashley. I did not say her name out loud, but it lingered in my thoughts with a new weight, no longer just a presence in my son's life, but someone who had been quietly shaping decisions behind the scenes, someone who understood the value of timing, of patience, of speaking softly until the right moment arrived. I folded the papers again, more carefully this time, and placed them back in the drawer, but I did not close it right away. Instead, I stood there for a moment, considering what it meant to be prepared, not just in the practical sense, but in the way that required a shift in how I saw myself in relation to everything around me. For years, I had taken pride in being accommodating, in stepping back when needed, in allowing others to take the lead, believing that was what kept peace in a family. But peace, I realize now, can sometimes look very similar to silence, and silence can be mistaken for agreement. I closed the drawer gently and turned back to the kitchen, the sunlight now stronger, filling the room with a brightness that felt almost out of place against the clarity settling in my mind. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, pausing briefly on Daniel's name before moving past it, not because I did not want to speak to him, but because I understood that whatever conversation needed to happen would not begin there. Not yet. Instead, I continued scrolling until I found a name I had not called in quite some time, someone who had once helped me organize my affairs years ago, someone who understood details, structure, the kind of quiet decisions that shape outcomes long before anyone else notices. I did not press call immediately. I simply held the phone in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the simplicity of what came next, and the significance behind it. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the sound fading as quickly as it came, and I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I was not waiting for something to happen to me. I was deciding what would happen next, and that, more than anything I had heard the night before, changed everything. I did not wait long before making the call, because waiting had been the habit that led me here in the first place, and I was no longer interested in repeating patterns that had quietly worked against me. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, the same table where I had spent years paying bills, planning holidays, writing birthday cards, and I pressed the number before I could talk myself into postponing it. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, steady and professional, the kind of voice that does not rush or assume, and for a moment I felt something settle inside me simply from hearing it. I introduced myself, and there was a brief pause before recognition came through, warm but measured, followed by a question about how I had been, the kind of polite inquiry that leaves space for as much or as little truth as you are willing to offer. I told him I needed to review my documents, that I wanted to make sure everything was in order, and I kept my tone even, my words simple, because there was no need to explain more than that. Not yet. We set a time for later that week, a quiet appointment in his office downtown, and when I ended the call, I placed the phone down gently, noticing how different that small action felt compared to the hesitation I had felt just hours before. The rest of the day moved with a kind of clarity I had not experienced in a long time, not rushed, not anxious, but deliberate, as if each step I took now carried a purpose that had been missing before. I opened cabinets, sorted through items I had not touched in years, not in a frantic way, but with a quiet intention, taking note of what mattered and what did not, what I had kept out of habit and what I truly needed. Every so often, my mind would drift back to Daniel, to the way he had looked the night before, the slight distance in his eyes, the way he had chosen not to say anything that might complicate the easy version of events he was living in. I did not feel anger toward him, not in the way I might have expected. What I felt was something quieter, a kind of understanding that did not excuse his silence, but explained it. The way people sometimes step back from difficult conversations, telling themselves they will handle it later, until later becomes a decision in itself. By the afternoon, the house felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because I had begun to see it differently, not as something that simply existed around me, but as something that belonged to me in a way that required attention, intention, protection. I walked from room to room, noticing details I had once overlooked, small repairs that needed to be made, papers that needed to be organized, decisions that had been delayed for no particular reason other than comfort. Comfort, I realized, can be a quiet kind of trap, the kind that keeps everything looking stable while small shifts happen underneath. That evening, Daniel called, his name lighting up the screen in a way that once would have brought immediate warmth, but now I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of a new awareness of how I chose to respond. His voice sounded normal, casual, asking if I had made it home safely, if everything was all right. The same questions from the night before, repeated as if consistency could replace presence. I told him I was fine, that the barbecue had been lovely, that the food was good, and I kept my voice steady, giving him exactly what he expected, no more, no less. There was a small pause on the line, the kind that suggests there might be something else, something unspoken, but it passed quickly, filled instead with a comment about work, about a busy week ahead, about plans that did not include me. I listened, responding when necessary, letting the conversation move at his pace. And when he said he would come by soon, I simply said that would be nice, not asking when, not pressing for specifics, because I understood now that vague promises were easier to offer than concrete ones. When the call ended, I set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet, not replaying the conversation, not searching for meaning in what had been left unsaid, because the meaning was already clear enough. I stood up, walked to the front door, and locked it, the soft click echoing slightly in the hallway, a small sound that carried more weight than it should have. It was not about keeping anyone out. It was about recognizing that this space, this life, required boundaries I had not been setting. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through the house with a sense of completion rather than routine, and as I reached the staircase, I paused, looking back at the living room, at the quiet arrangement of furniture, the photographs, the stillness that now felt less like emptiness and more like space waiting to be defined differently. I went upstairs and prepared for bed, setting the alarm for the next morning, knowing that the appointment I had scheduled was only the beginning, a first step in a series of decisions that would shape what came next. And as I lay down, the same steady silence surrounding me, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting to what others had decided. I was preparing for what I would decide myself. The morning of the appointment arrived with a quiet steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the day itself understood that something important was about to shift, even if nothing on the surface seemed different. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blouse and a pair of slacks that I had worn to important occasions before, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel grounded, composed, certain of myself in a way I had not been for a long time. The drive downtown took just under 20 minutes, the same route I had driven countless times in the past. Yet this time I noticed things I had not paid attention to in years, the storefronts that had changed, the quiet corners that remained the same, the steady movement of people who had their own plans, their own decisions to make. When I parked outside the office building, I sat for a moment before getting out of the car, my hands resting lightly on my lap, taking in a slow breath, not out of nervousness, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when you understand that what you are about to do matters more than anything you have avoided doing before. Inside, the office was just as I remembered, neat, organized, the soft hum of quiet conversation behind closed doors, the kind of place where decisions are made calmly, without raised voices, but with consequences that last far beyond the room. When I was called in, he greeted me with the same steady professionalism, offering a seat, asking how he could help, and I placed my folder on the desk between us, sliding it forward without hesitation. I told him I wanted to review everything, that I wanted to make changes, not drastic ones, but intentional ones, and I watched his expression carefully as he listened, noting the way he did not interrupt, did not assume, simply waited for me to continue. I explained that I wanted to ensure that my assets, my home, everything I had built, would be handled according to my wishes, not left open to interpretation or convenience. And as I spoke, I realized how rarely I had said those words out loud, how often I had assumed that things would simply work out as they should. He nodded, asking precise questions, guiding the conversation with a clarity that felt reassuring. And as we went through each document, each detail, I began to see how easily things could have been shifted without my direct involvement, how small gaps could become opportunities for someone else to step in and make decisions on my behalf. We discussed ownership, control, contingencies, the kind of details that most people avoid until it is too late, and for the first time, I did not feel overwhelmed by them. Instead, I felt something else, something steady and certain, a sense that I was finally taking responsibility for the parts of my life I had left unattended. When we reached the discussion of my will, I paused briefly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully, to make sure that what I was about to decide reflected not just what had happened recently, but what I now understood more clearly than ever before. I made adjustments, small on paper but significant in meaning, ensuring that control remained where it belonged, that no one could assume access without my explicit consent, that decisions about my future would not be made in quiet conversations I was not meant to hear. He reviewed everything once more, confirming that the changes were sound, that they would hold, that they reflected exactly what I had expressed, and when I signed the final document, the pen moved steadily in my hand, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. It was a simple act, one I had done many times before in different contexts, but this time it carried a weight that settled into me in a way I could not ignore. When the meeting ended, I gathered my papers, thanked him, and stepped back out into the daylight. The sun higher now, the streets busier, everything moving as it always had, yet I felt different walking back to my car, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with clarity. On the drive home, I did not replay the conversation or question my decisions. There was no need. What had been uncertain before was now defined. What had been assumed was now confirmed, and what had been left open was now closed. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood the same as always, quiet, familiar, waiting, but I no longer saw it as something that could be taken from me through quiet planning or polite avoidance. I saw it as something I had chosen to protect, something that reflected not just my past, but my understanding of my present. Inside, I set my keys down, placed the folder carefully in its place, and moved through the rooms with the same steady awareness I had begun to carry with me, noticing the small details, the way the light shifted through the windows, the way the air felt different now that I was no longer standing still within it. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Ashley, casual, friendly on the surface, asking if I would like to come by for dinner later that week. A simple invitation, the kind that once would have filled me with a quiet sense of belonging. I read the message once, then again, noting the timing, the ease of it, the assumption that everything remained unchanged. I set the phone down without responding immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, because for the first time, I understood that every response I gave, every step I took, would now be guided by something different, something that no longer depended on being included, but on deciding where I chose to stand. The message from Ashley stayed unanswered on my phone for the rest of the afternoon, not because I had forgotten about it, but because I was choosing, for the first time, not to respond on instinct. In the past, I would have replied within minutes, something polite, something agreeable, something that kept everything smooth and easy, but now I let the silence sit between us, not heavy, not dramatic, just present. I went about my day with a quiet focus, finishing small tasks around the house, folding laundry, organizing a drawer that had been cluttered for longer than I cared to admit, each action simple, ordinary, but carried out with a sense of control that felt new. Every so often, I would glance at my phone, not out of anxiety, but out of awareness, noticing that no follow-up message came, no second attempt to reach me, just that single invitation waiting for a response. By early evening, I finally picked up the phone and typed a reply, something measured and neutral, thanking her for the invitation and saying that I would let her know, nothing more, nothing less, and when I pressed send, I felt no urgency, no need to explain myself or fill the space with extra words. The next day passed quietly, and by the afternoon, Daniel called again, his voice carrying that same casual tone, but this time there was something slightly different beneath it, something almost cautious, as if he were testing the ground without quite realizing it. He asked if I had seen Ashley's message, if I was free later in the week, mentioning dinner again in a way that sounded rehearsed, and I listened carefully, not just to what he said, but to how he said it, the pauses, the slight shifts in his voice that suggested he was not entirely comfortable. I told him I had seen it, that I was considering my schedule, and I kept my answer simple, not offering immediate agreement, not asking for details, just leaving the statement as it was. There was a brief silence on the line, longer than before, and I could almost picture him trying to decide what to say next, how to move the conversation forward without stepping into something he was not ready to address. He mentioned work again, something about a new project, the kind of topic that filled space without requiring anything personal, and I responded politely, letting him speak, giving him the room he seemed to need, but not stepping in to carry the conversation the way I once would have. When the call ended, I placed the phone down and sat for a moment, not replaying his words, but recognizing the shift, small but noticeable, in the way he approached me, as if something in my tone, my distance, had registered even if he could not yet name it. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the back porch, the air cooler now, the light fading slowly, and I sat down in the old chair I had kept for years, the one that creaked slightly when I leaned back, a familiar sound that once blended into the background of my days. I looked out at the yard, the quiet stretch of grass, the fence that marked the boundary of the property, and I thought about boundaries in a different way than I ever had before, not as something that separated people, but as something that defined where one life ended and another began. For a long time, mine had been open, flexible, easy to step into, easy to rearrange without resistance, and I had mistaken that openness for strength, for generosity, for love. But now I understood that without clear edges, without a sense of ownership, even the most well-meaning intentions could be reshaped by others into something that no longer resembled what I had built. The following morning, I received a second message from Ashley, this one slightly more direct, asking if Thursday would work, suggesting a time, adding a small note about trying a new recipe, the tone still light, still friendly, but carrying a subtle insistence that had not been there before. I read it carefully, noting the difference, the way the invitation had shifted from optional to expected, and I set the phone down once again without answering immediately. Instead, I walked back into the house, moving through each room with that same steady awareness, noticing how everything remained in place, unchanged, yet felt entirely different because I was no longer moving through it the same way. I paused by the kitchen table, where the documents from the previous day were still fresh in my mind, where the decisions I had made had already begun to reshape what was possible, and I realized that this dinner, this simple invitation, was not just a meal. It was a moment, an opportunity for them to move their plan forward, to begin a conversation they believed I was not prepared for. I picked up my phone again, typed a response, and this time I agreed to come, choosing Thursday evening, confirming the time, keeping my words polite, calm, exactly as they would expect, and when I pressed send, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, not because I was returning to something familiar, but because I was stepping into something with a clarity they had not anticipated. They believed they were preparing me for a decision they had already made. What they did not understand was that I had already made mine. Thursday evening arrived with a quiet precision, the kind that does not announce itself but settles into place exactly as expected, and I prepared for it the same way I had prepared for everything else that week, calmly, deliberately, without rushing or hesitation. I chose a simple outfit, nothing that drew attention, nothing that suggested anything out of the ordinary, just the same kind of clothing I had worn to their house many times before, because I understood now that familiarity was part of what they were relying on. When I drove over, the streets were softly lit by the early evening glow, the sky fading into that pale blue that comes just before darkness, and I noticed how steady my hands felt on the steering wheel, how even my breathing remained, not because I was unaffected, but because I had already moved past the part where uncertainty lived. Their house looked the same as it always did, lights on in the windows, the front porch tidy, everything arranged to create the impression of warmth and welcome, and when Ashley opened the door, her smile was immediate, polished, her voice light as she greeted me, stepping aside to let me in as if nothing had ever shifted between us. Daniel was in the kitchen, setting plates on the table, and he looked up when I entered, offering a quick smile, a small nod, the same careful balance of familiarity and distance that had become his habit, and I returned it with the same calm expression I had practiced all week. Dinner was already prepared, the smell of roasted chicken and herbs filling the air. Something new, something Ashley had likely chosen deliberately, and I complimented it as I took my seat, noting the way she accepted the compliment with a slight tilt of her head, as if everything was unfolding exactly as she intended. We sat down together, the three of us, the table set neatly, glasses filled, the kind of scene that would look perfectly ordinary to anyone passing by. And for a while, the conversation stayed on safe ground: work, weather, small updates that required no real engagement. Each word placed carefully, each pause measured. I noticed the way Ashley would occasionally glance at Daniel, just briefly, just enough to signal something without making it obvious, and I saw how he responded with small shifts, a slight clearing of his throat, a quick adjustment in his posture, the kind of silent communication that comes from rehearsing something in advance. I listened more than I spoke, offering simple responses, allowing the space to remain open, because I knew they were waiting for the right moment, the point where the conversation would turn from ordinary to something else. It came slowly, almost gently, Ashley setting her fork down, folding her hands lightly on the table, her expression softening in a way that might have seemed caring if I had not already heard the truth behind it. She began by asking how I had been feeling, whether I was managing everything all right on my own, her tone careful, almost concerned, and I answered just as carefully, saying that I was doing well, that I had been keeping busy, that everything was in order, giving her nothing to challenge, nothing to build on. Daniel added something about how the house could be a lot to handle, how things can change as time goes on, his voice quieter now, less certain, and I watched him closely, noting the way he avoided looking directly at me as he spoke, as if the words themselves carried a weight he did not want to fully acknowledge. Ashley nodded, picking up where he left off, mentioning how important it was to think ahead, to consider options, to make sure everything was arranged in a way that would be easier for everyone. Her words smooth, practiced, the kind that sound reasonable on the surface while carrying something much more deliberate underneath. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I simply listened, letting them continue, letting them move through the conversation they had prepared, because I understood now that their confidence depended on believing I was hearing this for the first time. As Ashley began to mention specific ideas, places, arrangements that would be more suitable, more comfortable, more convenient, I noticed how certain she sounded, how she spoke as if the decision had already been made, and this was merely the explanation. Daniel nodded occasionally, adding small agreements, reinforcing the narrative she was building. And for a moment, I saw clearly the shape of what they had planned, not just the outcome, but the process, the careful way they intended to guide me toward it without confrontation. I folded my hands lightly in my lap, keeping my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, and when there was finally a pause, when they had said enough to feel confident in their approach, I looked at them both, meeting their eyes one at a time, and I felt that same steady clarity settle in, the same understanding that had guided me through the past few days. They believed this was the beginning of a conversation. They believed they were leading it. They did not yet realize that I had already reached the part where it would end. I let the silence settle after their words, not rushing to fill it, not offering the immediate reassurance they expected, and for the first time, I allowed that quiet to belong to me instead of smoothing it over for their comfort. I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, setting it back down with care, noticing the way both of them watched me now, their attention sharper, their confidence shifting slightly as they waited for my response. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, even, the same tone I had used all evening, but this time it carried something different, something steady that did not bend to meet them. I told them that I appreciated their concern, that I understood the importance of planning ahead, and I watched as Ashley gave a small nod, as if she had expected agreement, as if she believed the conversation was unfolding exactly as she had imagined. Daniel glanced at her briefly, a quick exchange of relief passing between them, and that was when I continued, not raising my voice, not changing my expression, simply adding that I had already taken care of those plans myself. The shift was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable, the kind that happens when something unexpected enters a carefully arranged moment. Ashley's posture straightened slightly, her smile tightening at the edges, and Daniel looked at me more directly now, his brows drawing together just enough to show confusion. I did not rush. I let the moment expand, giving my words space to settle before I explained further, telling them that earlier that week, I had met with my attorney, that I had reviewed all of my documents, and that I had made the necessary arrangements to ensure that my future would be handled according to my own decisions. Ashley's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, a small movement that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching so carefully, and Daniel shifted in his seat, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and unease. I continued, still calm, still measured, explaining that the house, my assets, everything I had built, was now structured in a way that left no room for assumption or external decision-making, that everything was clearly defined, clearly protected, and that any changes would come directly from me and no one else. The room felt different now, the air carrying a quiet tension that had not been there before, and for the first time that evening, Ashley did not immediately respond. When she did, her tone remained light, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a careful attempt to regain control of the conversation as she asked what exactly I meant, as if clarification might restore the balance she had expected. I met her gaze steadily and told her exactly what I meant, that I would not be moving anywhere unless I chose to, that no arrangements would be made without my direct involvement, and that I had ensured, legally and clearly, that my home would remain mine for as long as I wished it to be. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly in his chair, and I saw something shift in his expression, not anger, not even frustration, but the quiet realization that something had changed in a way he had not anticipated. Ashley opened her mouth as if to respond, then paused, her composure still intact, but her certainty no longer as solid as it had been just minutes before. I did not press further. I did not raise my voice or accuse or confront. I simply let the truth stand where it was, clear and unshaken, and I could see the difference it made, the way their assumptions had begun to unravel, the way the conversation they had prepared no longer had a place to land. After a moment, Daniel spoke, his voice quieter now, asking why I had not mentioned any of this before, and I answered honestly, telling him that no one had asked, that I had assumed my decisions were mine to make, just as theirs were theirs. It was not said with bitterness, not with accusation, just with a calm acknowledgement that seemed to settle more heavily than any argument could have. Ashley's gaze dropped briefly to the table before returning to me, her expression carefully composed, but I could see the calculation behind it now. The way she was adjusting, reassessing, trying to understand the boundaries she had not expected to encounter. I picked up my napkin, placing it neatly beside my plate, and I realized that I felt no anger in that moment, no need to prove anything beyond what I had already said. The power of it did not come from force or confrontation, but from the quiet certainty of knowing exactly where I stood. When I looked at them again, I saw something different in both of their faces, something that had not been there before, a recognition that the role they had assigned me no longer fit, that the assumptions they had built their plans on were no longer valid. I offered a small, polite smile, the same kind I had worn at the beginning of the evening, but this time it was not meant to maintain peace. It was simply an acknowledgement that the conversation had reached its end, whether they were ready for it or not, and that from this point forward, nothing would be decided without me standing firmly in the center of it. I did not stay much longer after that, not because I felt unwelcome, but because there was nothing left to be said that had not already been made clear. The plates remained on the table, half finished, the conversation shifting awkwardly back to safer topics that no one seemed fully committed to, and I allowed it to pass without trying to repair it, without stepping in to smooth over what had changed. When I finally stood up, I did so calmly, thanking Ashley for the meal, complimenting the effort she had put into it, because those things were still true, even if everything else had shifted. She responded politely, her smile still in place, but thinner now, more measured, and Daniel walked me to the door once again, just as he had after the barbecue, his movements familiar, his expression quieter than before. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying that faint stillness that comes after a conversation that has not gone as planned, and he stood there for a moment, as if searching for something to say that would bring things back to what they had been. He asked if I was upset, his voice low, careful, and I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the boy I had raised, not as the man I had been trying to understand, but simply as he was in that moment, someone standing between what had been and what was now becoming. I told him I was not upset, and that was the truth, not because nothing had happened, but because I had already moved past the point where anger would have served any purpose. He nodded slowly, as if trying to accept that answer, even if he did not fully understand it. And when he said that they were only trying to help, I did not argue with him. I did not correct him. I simply said that I understood, because I did, in a way that no longer required agreement. When I got into my car, he remained by the door, watching as I pulled away, and I did not look back immediately, not out of avoidance, but because I knew that what needed to be seen had already been seen. The drive home was quiet, the roads mostly empty, the familiar route unfolding in front of me with a clarity that felt different from before, not because the streets had changed, but because I had. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, the porch light casting its steady glow, the windows reflecting the darkness outside, and I sat in the car for a moment, just as I had done a few nights earlier, but this time the feeling was different. There was no weight pressing down, no uncertainty waiting to be sorted through, just a quiet sense of completion, as if something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally found its place. Inside, the house welcomed me with its usual stillness, but it no longer felt empty. It felt defined, intentional, mine in a way that went beyond ownership and settled into something deeper, something rooted in the decisions I had made and the clarity I had claimed. I moved through the room slowly, turning off the lights, setting things in order, not out of habit, but out of choice, and when I reached the living room, I paused in front of the photographs once more, the same images I had looked at days before, but now they seemed different, not because they had changed, but because I no longer viewed them as reminders of something I might lose. They were simply part of a life I had lived, one that had brought me to this moment, one that no longer needed to define what came next. I went upstairs and prepared for bed, the same quiet routine, the same familiar motions, but each one carried a sense of purpose that had not been there before, and as I turned off the lamp and lay down, I allowed myself to think briefly about what would happen moving forward, not in terms of what Daniel or Ashley might do, but in terms of what I would allow, what I would choose, what I would no longer accept without question. The next morning, I woke to the same soft light filtering through the curtains, the same quiet house, but I did not linger in bed. I got up, started the day, and as I moved through the kitchen, pouring my coffee, opening the blinds, I realized that the shift I had felt the night before had not faded. It remained, steady and present, a part of me now rather than a reaction to something outside of me. Later that day, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel, shorter this time, simpler, asking if we could talk soon, just the two of us, and I read it carefully, noting the difference in tone, the absence of assumption, the space it left open. I did not respond immediately. I set the phone down and looked out the window, watching the light settle across the yard, the quiet stretch of space that had once felt like something I might be pushed out of and now felt entirely different. They had believed they could decide where I belonged, believed they could prepare a future for me without my voice in it. And for a time, I had allowed that possibility to exist without question. But that time had passed, not with a confrontation, not with raised voices or dramatic exits, but with something far quieter and far more lasting. I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and allowed myself a small, knowing smile, not directed at anyone else, not meant to be seen or understood by anyone but me. They had planned to move me out of my life, to shift me into a space that suited them, to make decisions on my behalf while believing I would accept them without resistance. Instead, I had simply stepped into my own place, drawn the lines they had not expected, and made it clear without saying more than necessary that I was not going anywhere unless I chose to. And in that quiet, steady understanding, I found something I had not realized I had been missing for a very long time. Not just control, not just security, but a sense of self that no one else could rearrange or decide for me ever again.